Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual practices. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "For in the true nature of things, if we rightly consider, every green tree is far more glorious than if it were made of gold and silver." Sometimes we need artists to remind us how to see well and how to rightly consider what lies beyond the surface of nature. In this episode, we'll feature two artists whose work helps us to see beyond the surface of the created world. Our first conversation will be with poet Lenae Nofziger, and the second with wildlife photographer Alycia Scheidel. You will find examples of their work on the podcast website at www.circlewood.online. We'll begin with Lenae reading 3 of her poems in a series called Branches, Leaves, a Life. Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast.
Sacraments. Under the right conditions, soil, water, the seed sprouts into a pair of impulses, down, up. It grows roots, trunk, branches, leaves, a life. Years pass, decades. Sun, rain, clouds, snow. Bark hardens, dead limbs drop. Leaves unfurl, reach skyward, fall. Fruit ripens, tumbles, rots. Light feeds dark, dark light. Sap rises in secret, moving through what is rough and what is wood, through what is and will become the heart. A word. A raven launches herself and flies out of sight. The empty branch trembles. Sacred ground. You're likely to miss it. Your senses no longer attuned to the sacred, nor to groves of trees. You can recognize a forest, sure, or a decorative Japanese maple, or a row of pink-blossomed cherries lining a boulevard. But the difference between a grove, say, and a copse, or just a clump, that's nothing to bother the busy postmodern mind. You'll probably walk right past. But if somehow you do find the sacred grove, if you tremble slightly and remove your shoes, if you gird your loins, whatever that means, and step foolishly, bravely among the leafy branches, what do you expect? Will the earth shake? Will the trees bow down to you? Will some goddess extend her hospitable hands in welcome? O mortal, must everything always be about you? The god is away on business. The goddess has many concerns. If you wait in the dappled shadows, if you let your eyes adjust to the play of light and dark, you will begin to see, as if it were just arriving or suddenly revealing itself, as if it had not been there all along, a figure. You know exactly what it will ask of you, mortal. You who wrestle with overwhelming information. You who keep track of earthquakes, of the rise and fall of governments, of all the voices weighing in. You who live in one small corner of the ever-expanding universe. Is it any wonder that the gods are busy elsewhere? The wonder is that God is here at all, just here, among this copse of brick buildings, in that grove of laptops, in this thicket of words. O mortal, unless the sacrifice you carry in your trembling arms is your own beating heart, why offer it at all?
Lenae, I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about yourself. You clearly have a very, I'll say, intimate relationship with creation, with the natural world. It's so clear from your poetry. I'm wondering if you could comment on that relationship, your relationship to creation, but even how that intersects with your spirituality.
Yeah, I think that's lovely. Well, I really have my whole life, I think, felt like the beauty of the natural created world is such a reflection of God's love and care for us. And so that has been a sign for me of the way that God loves me, and loves all of us. One of the things that I like about poetry is that you can look at very small and particular things carefully. And I think when you do that with the natural world, when you look at almost anything that you can find outside carefully with some loving attention, then it will reveal to you all kinds of amazing things. Like like you just think of the whole macrocosm in that microcosm. There's just so much to see in every bit. I was sitting with my husband out in front of our house one day in the summer, and he was like, "Look at this tree." We have this tree trunk that was in between our chairs, and he was like, "Look at all the different colors on it, on the bark." And I was like, I hadn't even noticed that. But when you look at that, it just is amazing. It's rich and rich and rich.
Actually, as you say that, it harkens back to the poems that you've read to us. And Sacred Ground seems to be exploring that very question about looking and seeing and not seeing.
Right. I think that's good. I spent some time in West Africa, in Côte d'Ivoire, and I felt like I was living in this Old Testament situation. Like we would go to collect water and we would take our shoes off. And I really was like, wow, sacred ground all around, all around. And that was a really rich situation for me. But I think that when I pay attention, and I think this poem is an invitation to myself to pay attention. Like I do think that the natural world is a special revealing of God's nature. But I also think that God is available to us through created objects, even complicated and technical objects like our computers or a digital podcast or whatever. So if I pay attention to those things too, I think I'm often rewarded by finding the sense of Christ being there as well.
So it's really learning a way of seeing, or at least having the discipline to see with intentionality, as you put it.
Yeah. I think that's true. Yeah, and
so,
the poetry helps me to focus that.
Yeah. Can you say more about that? I mean, what is the role of poetry? Are you interpreting? Are you calling attention to what you see? Are you mediating whatever it is that's reflected in nature in ways that people can maybe perceive it better?
Well, I don't know about other people. I mean, I feel like it's a mediation or maybe a meditation that is useful to me. Like I'm interested, obviously, in the natural world, which doesn't speak in the languages that I am used to interpreting clearly. And I am also interested as a poet in biblical texts, which I feel sometimes are also similarly opaque. Like there's this translation issue. So when trees are being trees, what their gestures mean, I don't always interpret that very clearly. And in biblical stories, sometimes the gestures also are difficult for me to interpret. But I think paying attention through this lens of language in the poem can help me. And at least, I don't know if I come to any particular clarity of answers, but I feel as if I've been part of a conversation And I think I think poetry can hold this sort of open space for us to have this ongoing conversation. So that's one of the things that I really like about the discipline of poetry, of the forms and the paying attention to the use of language and the line breaks and everything.
So you're a college professor, and you are probably aware of the differences, the proclivities of this current young generation, especially when it comes to God, to church, to spirituality. And there I think is a kind of a disenchantment in some ways with perhaps the forms that we grew up being comfortable with, forms of church or liturgy or spiritual practices. And I do know that one of the things that you hear about the folks that we teach is that they are actually finding that engagement with nature, encounter with nature, is actually one of the ways that they say they will encounter God. It's one of those realms, those spaces where they sense spirit. I'm wondering if you have actually perceived that and how you've actually engaged that dynamic with your students.
Oh, that's a really great question. Now I feel challenged to do that some more. One of the things that I like to do with my writing students is to have them encounter their place in a new way. So one assignment that I've sometimes asked them to do is to go outside at night, but to find a way to inhabit darkness, which students tend to avoid. We all sort of tend to avoid that. And that can be a really rich sort of source of new perspectives. It's an invitation to pay attention to the things that are very familiar to you, but now you're seeing them or not seeing them in a different way. I have a 19-year-old son, first-year student in college, and he for sure encounters God in the natural world and spends a lot of his time climbing and in the mountains. So he's not my students, but I've at least fostered that, maybe encouraged that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I asked the question because, as I told you, your poem, A Word, is my favorite of the three that you gave us. And it left me breathless. And it did what I think you're trying to describe. It disarmed me. It destabilized me a bit into a different way of perceiving or thinking about an image, which actually is fairly familiar to me, right? I've seen that so many times, but it caused me to look in a different way at birds in general for the last week or so, honestly. I think it's that disarming, that challenging us to look at things in a different way, which I value so much about your poem.
Thank you. It's interesting that you're talking about students and that poem, because I do think that I was thinking about, we often have that metaphor of teachers were like planting seeds and then the seeds grow for the students and we sort of outside of our view with them. But I feel a lot of times the reverberations of my own words, things that I have put out there, and then I'm left sort of trembling, and we don't often talk about that situation. I'm not exactly sure if that's what I was thinking about, but I do often think about that feeling after I've said something to students and how I feel about not knowing how that's going to fly, in their direction or not in their direction. I just don't. There's a lot of gaps where I feel like I need to have Christ's intercession as a teacher.
Yeah. But their response in some ways is a gift back to you.
That's right.
It's almost a reinterpretation of what you've given them.
Right. Yes, that's a very nice way to put it.
We've been in conversation with professor and poet Lenae Nofziger. If you would like to read her poetry in print, you can do so in an online journal called Christ in Cascadia. You can easily access that site with a website search or use the link to Lenae's poems in the show notes for this podcast. Also at Christ in Cascadia, you will find a gallery of poignant photos shot by our next guest, wildlife photographer Alycia Scheidel. Again, you can go directly to the Christ in Cascadia site or find a link on our podcast webpage at www.circlewood.online/podcast. Please join me now for the second part of this episode, a conversation with photographer Alycia Scheidel. So Alycia, so good of you to talk to us today about your art, about your photography. I'm curious if you could orient us a bit to talk about why photography? Why is this your chosen medium?
So I've always said that I think if I'd been blessed with the ability to draw or paint, then I'd be doing that instead. But as I've gotten older and really started to lean more into photography as a craft, I don't think I would give it up for other mediums. And there's a few different reasons for that. One of which being that I really love the challenge of presenting the world that people might see every day in a new way, a way that makes them stop and marvel or question or want to know more, ways that really invoke emotion that maybe they haven't felt in a long time or they never have felt or they want to feel more of. Ever since I was a child, actually, I felt this really deep and profound connection to the world around me and to nature in particular. I've seen it in these varying layers and shades and really just seen it as magical, which sounds cliche, but I've been able to look at objects or people or places that other people have passed over as mundane. And I guess I've been blessed with this ability to see the things that aren't visible, if that makes any sense, to really see the divine in the ordinary.
It really sounds like you have a sort of deep value of trying to invite people into that. So on the one hand, you're talking about a way that you see the world in terms of its depth, complexity, elements of design, but you're not content to stay in that with yourself.
I want to draw other people in. I aspire in my photography to make unseen things seen and to show people that magic is real and it's not something I have to create or they have to create. And it is amazing when you can do that. And I think that is art in and of itself, is creating magic. But really, it's all around us and it is us in so many ways. For me in photography, there's these moments when the light and the composition and the subject all come together in such a way that I swear you're getting a glimpse of the divine or of another world beyond this one. There's this quote by my favorite author, Ellen Montgomery. She wrote Anne of Green Gables. And this has really stuck with me and sticks with me for photography. It's very true of that. So she says, "It has always seemed to me, ever since early childhood, amid all the commonplaces of life, I was very near to a kingdom of ideal beauty. Between it and me hung only a thin veil. I could never draw it quite aside, but sometimes the wind fluttered it and I caught a glimpse of the enchanting realms beyond. Only a glimpse, but those glimpses have always made life worthwhile." To be able to kind of lift the veil aside a little bit and remind people that this isn't all there is.
Do you feel like that in general, people have a harder time seeing this depth, seeing behind the veil, as you call it, especially when it comes to nature?
I do. I think there's a very large disconnect, particularly between, people and nature. I think as we move further from the land and further from our roots and those roots being we needed the land to survive. And in many ways, the land has needed us to survive in ways too. I think the further we move away from that, the more disconnected people become. And I mean, that's another big reason why I'm choosing wildlife photography, because I want to kind of reacquaint people with what's around them and to bring awareness to that.
Tell me a bit more about your relationship to nature. You've made hints of the divine presence in nature. And so I'm wondering, does that imply then that that there is a relationship going on there in terms of almost person to person when it comes to your connection to the natural world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is the hardest question of them all, because I think in order to answer this, I need to really explain kind of what nature is to me and has been to me, and that sometimes feels impossible. So at the risk of sounding melodramatic, I'm going to say that for me, nature is everything. It has sustained and saved me time and time again, and it's always been there. My relationship with nature started from birth, really. And I want to stop for a minute and just say that I recognize that my being able to say that and that being my reality is in and of itself a privilege, because not everyone gets the choice to live their life closely with nature. Therein lies one of the reasons that I am invested in nature and wildlife photography, is wanting to create equitable access for everyone to that. So I grew up on a farm in California, and my version of nature was a little more cultivated or manicured, but our ranch bordered a nature preserve. So I had the opportunity as a kid to see coyotes, beavers, otters, just a whole incredible range of birds. And that was very formative for me and has remained so. I live in a log cabin now, very deep in the Markworth State Forest in Duval. And I've been living here about 5 years now. And, you know, with every season that passes, my understanding and my connection with the natural world deepens and broadens. And it's like, I think, okay, this is it. There's no possible way I can delve deeper. There's no possible way I can appreciate nature more than I do now. For me, it does go so far beyond the purely physical and plunges straight into spiritual realms. A big part of my growth and my understanding in nature has been having to come to terms with the relationship between human beings and nature. For so long, I've held this belief that humans aren't good, that we steal resources and we exploit the earth. And it took me finally reading Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer to come to realize there is a balance and that we depend on one another, humans and the natural world.
So you have been raised in a Judeo-Christian tradition, and clearly what you're talking about now tends not to be part of the mainstream understanding of people's relationship to creation. You know, in a lot of the church, especially the Western church, there's a very kind of, at best, stewardship model where we stand above nature. It's our job to take care of it. You know, and at worst, nature is ours to use and exploit as we will. So, you know, what you're talking about in terms of a different way of seeing our place in relationship to the rest of nature is really resistant to that idea. And so I'm curious about how that has evolved in you. How is that way of seeing met with resistance, either in you or in people around you? How has your theology, your spirituality developed?
The evolution of kind of where I am now in terms of spirituality began when I moved here into the woods, into my little log cabin. And when I first got out here, I still held to a lot of very traditional Christian values about everything, but about nature in particular. In ways, I would say that kind of hindered my ability to understand nature and to get on a deeper, kind of more intimate level with it. And that's not to say that Christianity in itself prohibits you from reaching that. I think that the modern church and these ideas of subduing and conquering nature, nature is really my church. It is my place of worship. It is where I go to find God. I have never felt closer to God, to the divine, than being outside in a grove of cedar trees or, beside a brook. Or honestly, lately when I've been going out to photograph animals, it takes so much to try to find one certain species. I yesterday spent 4 hours looking for a northern saw-whet owl, and they're very elusive. owls are in general, and I was getting very frustrated. This has been a recurring theme in my wildlife photo journey, is just getting frustrated at, not being able to find something, putting so much work and so much effort into it. But there have been those moments when I've had to stop and just remind myself, like, okay, why am I doing this? It's not for the glory of trying to get a photo, right? Because if that is, I need to stop. I need to give this up. It's been a reminder to myself, like, I'm connecting to nature, I'm connecting to God, I'm connecting to these parts of myself that I forget about so often. And so many times in that moment when I finally wrestled those demons and had that connection again, the animal I've been looking for is right there. That didn't happen yesterday, unfortunately, but it happened last week with a pygmy owl. I was at that giving up point, and I was angry, and I was on my way back to my car, and in the middle of the path, there's a pygmy owl. They're these tiny little birds, and it was just there, and nature has become my solace and my place of worship. My favorite poet is Mary Oliver, and she wrote a lot about her spiritual relationship with nature and with animals and nature. And there's a quote of hers that I really love that I think speaks really well to this question. And it is, "I have my way of praying, as you no doubt have yours." In that, she's referring to what she had said previously in her poem about why and how she goes into the woods. She goes to talk to the birds, to hug the trees. That's her form of worship.
I look at so many of the people who have either walked away from the church because they can't find their relevance, they can't find their connection to God in the institutional church. And I certainly look at the generation of my daughter who is in college now, and many of them have become disenchanted with the traditional institutional church. I wonder if you see hope in this other way of spirit encounter that you're trying to describe. Do you find that there might be hope for people who have lost sight of connection to God, at least through the ways that perhaps in the West we're taught, are the right ways to perceive God?
It is hard for me, I think, because I grew up and was rooted so deeply in pretty conservative circles of Christianity, where, how I'm talking now is very demonized. And, there's certain members of my family and community that I can't talk like this in front of it. They wouldn't really understand it, if you will. I think a lot of people try to put God in a box and try to say you can only experience them in this way or in these places.
Is it possible, though, that in fact your photography might be an invitation to people to do that very thing? That perhaps even the photo itself might be that open window into the realm of spirit, as you put it, pulling back the veil. Is it possible that the photos in themselves can actually be that invitation for people?
I would hope so. I would really hope that is conveyed in my work.
We've been in conversation with poet Lenae Nofziger and wildlife photographer Alycia Scheidel, two artists who work at the intersection of nature and spirituality. If you want to read Lenae's poems and view Alycia's photographs, please find the links in the podcast show notes. Earthkeepers podcast explores ways in which we can change ourselves, our communities, and our cultures to help us to care for the earth in holistic and regenerative ways. Through curated conversations, we highlight the wisdom of thought leaders and change agents who are making a difference and showing us a way forward. When Earthkeepers stand together, they amplify the impact of their resistance against environmental injustice and multiply their efforts for renewal and restoration. I am Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Olfers. Forrest Reed is our editor and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman, and Jessalyn Megerly is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening, and please join us next time on the Earthkeepers podcast.